special.
Airy textures can add a special feel.
Yes, I want it to feel as though I'm biting into a cloud.
Whipped cream can add an ethereal quality to your dish.
It needs a garnish.
A dusting of confectioner sugar.
Perfect.
Want to break into cybersecurity but don't have experience? The Google Cybersecurity Certificate uses
If you're connecting a computer to a screen, or really any type of consumer electronics to a video display, device, then you're probably using HDMI. This stands for High Definition Multimedia Interface. This If you're connecting a computer to a screen, or really any type of consumer electronics to a video display device, then you're probably using. Here's a video adapter that has. If you're connecting a computer to a screen, or really any type of consumer electronics to a video display device, then you're probably using HDMI. This stands for High Definition Multimedia Interface. This sends both audio and video through the same digital connection, and it has about a 20-meter maximum range before you start to lose too much signal and start seeing blockiness on the screen. This is one of the most common connector types that you'll find on today's monitors and televisions. It's a 19-pin connector, and it's referred to in HDMI as a Type A connector. Here's a video adapter that has a number of different outputs. It has DVI and DisplayPort, but it also has an HDMI connection right here at the bottom. You can see that it's almost in the shape of a rectangle, but the bottom corners are indented in just a bit, which means that an HDMI cable would be the only thing that would fit into that interface. On that picture of the display adapter, we saw that one of those interfaces was a DisplayPort interface. DisplayPort is a video format that is also able to send audio and video over the same connection, and it was one of the first display type connections that sent it in a packetized form, very similar to how you might send information over an Ethernet network. This also has some compatibility with both HDMI and DVI. You can use a passive adapter to convert between DisplayPort to HDMI or DisplayPort to DVI. On some devices, you may find that the DisplayPort interface is the smaller style, known as the mini DisplayPort, but on desktop computers and video interface cards, you'll probably find the full-size DisplayPort connector. Notice that the DisplayPort connector has small little locks along the top of the connector, and when you plug it into the interface, it tends to lock in place. This means that connector will not accidentally pull out of that connector, and usually there's a button along the top or the sides of the connector that allow you to unlock the connection so you can pull it out of the interface. If you are trying to disconnect a cable connection from a computer and you notice that it's not coming out of that connection, then it probably is a DisplayPort interface, and you'll need to press down on that button before removing it from the computer. Here's another video card with many different types of video outputs, not just DVI and HDMI, but a number of different DisplayPort connections. You'll notice that DisplayPort and HDMI are similar to each other, at least in size, but they are very different in their form factor. You'll notice the DisplayPort is a bit of a rectangle with one of the corners that's a little bit slanted. That means that you can't accidentally plug in HDMI to DisplayPort or vice versa. If you're working with some older systems, you may run into a DVI interface. That stands for Digital Visual Interface. One of the challenges with DVI is that it's a single connector type with multiple types of connections. So you can see there's a DVI-A, a DVI-D single link, DVI-D dual link, and so on. As the name implies, a single link and a dual link video connection are able to send different amounts of traffic, effectively doubling on the dual link connection. A single link can transmit information at approximately 3.7 gigabits per second, which is able to support a traditional HD connection, which is 1920 by 1200 in resolution. We saw with HDMI and DisplayPort that we were able to send both audio and video through the same connection. If you're plugging into a DVI connection, you are only sending video signals through that connector. You might also run into some other variations of DVI, such as the DVI-A that's able to send analog signals. This is a standard connector that is able to coexist or be backwards compatible with VGA. We'll look at VGA connectors in just a moment. DVI-D connectors are sending digital information, and if you run into a DVI-I connection, that is a DVI integrated connection, it can send both digital and analog signals in the same connector. If you are working with DVI, make sure you look at the connector that's on your computer and the connector that you're using for your cable to make sure you're using the proper connection for both of those devices. And depending on the video card that you're using, you might have an option as to which DVI connector you might use. So it's important to know that there are differences, and you'll need to make the right decision over which interface would be the best one to use for your purposes. Legacy equipment tends to use a video standard known as VGA. This is the Video Graphics Array Standard. VGA uses this standard connector we refer to as a DB15 connector. There are 15 pins inside of the connector, and the connector itself is shaped like the letter D. The size of this connector is an E shape. Technically speaking, this is called a DE15, but you'll also see it commonly written as DB15. You'll also notice that VGA connectors tend to have a very standard blue color associated with them. That's because there are a series of standardized colors that were rolled out as part of a PC system design guide. VGA, very similar to DVI, only sends video signals through this link. We don't send any audio over these VGA connectors. And because this is an analog signal, we tend to start seeing a degrading of signal once we get past 5 or 10 meters of total cable length. Here's the back of a motherboard that supports a number of different video types. There is HDMI plugged into a connector. We can see there's VGA on this motherboard. This motherboard also supports a DVI connection. Although we tend to see a number of different video standards, fortunately the connector types are very different between all three. So it should be very easy to differentiate between VGA, DVI, and HDMI. These days, we're also sending a lot of video signals over a USB-C connector. USB-C is a connector type, and there could be a number of different signals going across that particular cable. For example, USB could be sending power or serial data over that connection, but we could also put Thunderbolt data, DisplayPort, HDMI, and a type of connections for mobile devices called a Mobile High Definition Link, or MHL. This means some devices are able to send many different types of signals over that same USB connection, and all we need is to provide the right cable and the right connection.
Slack is the engine for all enablement here at Writer. There's categorically no better tool than Slack in a Slack list.
If you're connecting a computer, and all we need is to provide the right cable and the right MHL. This means for that connection, but we could also put Thunderbolt data, DisplayPort, HDMI, and a type of connection. If you're connecting a computer to a screen, or really any type of consumer electronics to a video display device, then you're probably using HDMI. This stands for high. If you're connecting a hard drive inside of a desktop computer, then you're probably using a standard interface known as SATA. This is a serial AT attachment, and there have been a number of different versions of SATA through the years. There was a SATA revision 1.0. If you're connecting a hard drive inside of a desktop computer, then you're probably using a standard interface known as SATA. This is a serial AT attachment, and there have been a number of different versions of SATA through the years. There was a SATA revision 1.0 that supported 1.5 gigabits per second. Version 2.0 doubled the speed to 3 gigabits per second. Version 3.0 doubled the speed again to 6 gigabits per second. With SATA revision 3.2, the speeds increased to 16 gigabits per second. And there's an external version of SATA known as eSATA. It's very similar in functionality to the internal version of SATA, and it supports connecting an external drive over a cable that's approximately 2 meters in length. The SATA standard supports 2 physical connections on the back of these storage drives, one that is functionality to the internal version of SATA, and it supports connecting an external drive over a cable that's approximately 2 meters in length. The SATA standard supports 2 physical connections on the back of the storage drive. Drives. One that is 15 pins, the longer connector, is used for power, and the smaller connector, which is 7 pins, is used for data. This particular drive not only supports the SATA power connection, but it also supports the older style Molex power connector. With SATA, there is a direct connection between the smaller connector, which is 7 pins, is used for data. This particular drive not only supports the SATA power connection, but it also supports the older style Molex power connector. With SATA, there's a direct connection between the drive itself and the motherboard connector. It's a one-to-one relationship. So the one cable that you're plugging in for power has a single cable that's plugging into your power source or your power supply. The other cable used for data is a single cable that's running from the storage drive to the data connector on the motherboard. SATA doesn't support any type of daisy chaining or multiple drives on a single cable, so this makes it very easy to understand. If there are 8 SATA interfaces on a motherboard, it can support 8 total drives. The SATA connectors are very easy to pick out on a motherboard such as this one. You can see the SATA connectors are here closer to the bottom of this motherboard. If we zoom up a bit, you can see this motherboard supports both SATA 2 and SATA 3 standard connectors, and it looks like there's a total of 6 connectors on this motherboard. Here's another motherboard with a slightly different alignment of SATA connections, and this motherboard appears to support 4 different SATA data connections. As I mentioned before, it's a one-to-one relationship between the connector on the motherboard and the connector on the storage drive. You can see we have a blue, orange, and black cable coming from the SATA connections on this motherboard, and they're corresponding to the blue, orange, and black data connectors on these drives. This is obviously only half of the connections that we'll need for these drives to operate. They'll need power, so we need to plug in the SATA power connectors on each of these drives. It's relatively straightforward to connect a SATA drive. You obviously have the data connection and the power connection. To be able to connect the drive to the data line, we simply plug in the data cable, and now we have a connectivity between this drive and the motherboard. As I mentioned earlier, there are not only standards for internal SATA connections, but there's also a standard for an external SATA connection. And these are different types of connectors. The signal sent across the wire is effectively the same between the internal and external drive, but the connector itself is slightly different between the two. It's difficult to put these side by side because obviously the SATA standard is generally on the inside of the computer and the eSATA standard is almost always on the outside of the computer. But you can see the SATA connection has that very distinctive L shape associated with it, and that cable is very different than the one you would use for eSATA, which has a completely different style. And you obviously can't plug an eSATA into a SATA connection and vice versa. If you're using an eSATA, you will need an eSATA cable, and if you're plugging it internally to a SATA drive, you will need a SATA cable. So if you're looking at the back of your computer and you see a couple of connectors that you may not immediately recognize, have a closer look. Those might be eSATA connections.
Explaining complex topics can be challenging. Highlight the text you want to simplify and let Grammarly rewrite it. Grammarly makes your message clear so it's understood. Download it for free at Grammarly.com.
Try gummy vitamins from Nature Made, the #1 pharmacist recommended vitamin and supplement brand.
In your IT career, you will have many instances where you need a certain type of cable, but you don't have that exact cable in your tool bag. However, there may be ways to put multiple devices, cables, and adapters together to create the type of interface you need. Sometimes these connections are electrically compatible with each other, and you simply need a cable that has one type of connector on one side and another type of connector on the other. But occasionally you'll need to convert from one format to another, so there may be some additional processing that occurs or power that's required to facilitate that process. Most of these adapters and converters are designed for temporary use, although sometimes they do turn into more of a permanent connection. When we were moving from DVI connections to HDMI, do turn into more of a permanent connection. When we were moving from DVI connections to HDMI, we tended to use a lot of DVI to HDMI cables or DVI to HDMI adapters. This is because DVI-D, the digital version of DVI, and HDMI, which is also a digital standard, are electrically compatible with each other. So you could connect one end of the cable to DVI-D, the other end of the cable to HDMI, and you'd be able to send that video signal from one device to the other without any type of signal conversion. The DVI to HDMI converter is very similar to the cable. It's much smaller, of course, but it does provide a way to convert from one format to the other. Another useful backward converter is very similar to the other end of the cable to HDMI, and you'd be able to send that video signal from one device to the other without any type of signal conversion. The DVI to HDMI converter is very similar to the cable. It's much smaller, of course, but it does provide a way to convert from one format to the other. Another useful backwards compatibility is between DVI-A, the analog version of DVI, and VGA. Both of those two signal types will work with each other, although technically only 640 by 480 resolution is officially supported. But since they are both analog connections, you might just need a simple adapter to change from the VGA 15-pin connector to the larger DVI connection. If you're moving from the analog VGA connection to a digital version of DVI, then you will need some type of signal conversion to be able to convert between those two formats. But in a pinch, these types of converters can come in handy, especially when you just need to make a quick change between one video standard and another. If you have a newer laptop, one of the things you might notice is that those laptops are getting thinner and thinner, and suddenly we've now realized there's not enough space to put a full-size RJ45 Ethernet connection on our newer laptops. But in many cases, we still need wired connectivity to be able to connect to other devices. This means you might need some type of adapter or converter that can change USB connectivity into an Ethernet connection. If you don't want to rely on wireless connectivity everywhere you go, or you might need wired connectivity to directly connect to a device or to perform network troubleshooting, then having one of these converters in your bag can be very useful. Another challenge you might run into is that many of these laptops no longer have the larger USB-A type connectors. For that reason, we might need another type of adapter that's able to convert from USB-C to USB-A that would then allow us to plug in a USB-A peripheral. Sometimes these are longer cables, so you can move them away from that smaller interface on the laptop itself, or it might be a simple adapter that you plug in that would give you access to a USB-A connection. And if you're not sure exactly what type of connector you might need, or you just like to be planning for any particular contingency, you might want to get a USB hub. This plugs into your laptop over a USB connection and provides a number of different outputs on the USB hub itself. This particular hub supports USB, SD memory connectors, HDMI, Ethernet, and other types of connections. USB hub you want to get like connector you might give you access to a USB-A connection. And if you're not sure exactly what type of connector you might need, or you just like to be planning for any particular contingency, you might want to get a USB hub. This plugs into your laptop over a USB connection and provides a number of different outputs on the USB hub itself. This particular hub supports USB, SD memory connectors, HDMI, Ethernet, and other types of connections. Many of these laptops itself types of connections.
CompTIA certification is too expensive? Let me show you some math. A CompTIA certification is going to make up to $15,000 more than somebody who's non-certified. At $15,000 divided by 12, $1,250. That's more than $1,200. And that right there pays for your certification in 2 weeks. And if
We'll start our conversation of copper connectors with one that is relatively common, an RJ11 connector. This is a 6-position connector with 2 conductors inside. Sometimes you may see this written as 6P2C. Sometimes you'll see this with 4 wires or 4 conductors inside, which technically makes it an RJ14, but generally speaking, we call them all RJ11 connectors. This is the type of connector that you will commonly use if you're plugging into an analog telephone connection, or more recently, a DSL or digital subscriber line connection. So if your internet connection uses these telephone cables to bring in that digital signal with DSL, then you're using an RJ11 connector. A larger version of this modular connector is an RJ45. That stands for Register Jack Type 45. This is an 8-position connector with 8 conductors inside, and you can count all 8 of those conductors in this single connection. This is also referred to as a modular connection. Sometimes we refer to it as an Ethernet connection because it is very commonly used for Ethernet networks, but RJ45 connectors can be used for serial connections and many other connection types as well. There are slight differences in the size of an RJ11 versus an RJ45. They're next to each other here on the back of this DSL modem. You can see the RJ11 is slightly smaller than the RJ45 connection. Unfortunately, this makes it very easy to make a mistake if you're reaching behind a device to plug things in, because you could accidentally plug in an RJ11 connector into an RJ45 connection. The RJ45 connector, of course, is too large to fit into the RJ11, so you'll just need to double check and make sure that when you're plugging in RJ11 that you're really plugging it into the appropriate interface. One common type of coax copper connection is an F connector. The F connector is commonly used for cable television connections, and of course, this also extends into the cable modem connection. Obviously, your coax is coming in from your cable provider or internet service provider, and the F connector commonly has this threaded connection at the end so that you can screw it into the connection, and it's not easily going to be removed from that connection without unscrewing it. In the very middle of this coax is the single copper connector that's used to send and receive signals over that cable connection. If you were to look at the specifications for your cable modem, you would see that it follows the standard of DOCSIS, which is Data Over Cable Service Interface Specification. And that DOCSIS modem that you're using for your cable modem is connecting to the cable modem network using that F connector. Here's the connection on the back of the cable modem. You've got the female F connector on the cable modem itself, and this is the coax cable with an F connector on the end of it that's used to screw into that cable modem connection. If you're working in a building where there are hundreds or even thousands of twisted pair cables, then you may have large walls of punch-down blocks that are used to terminate those wires. These punch-down blocks are used because they are very fast. You can simply push the wire into the connection and punch it down with the appropriate tool, and it's also relatively inexpensive. You don't have to put an individual connector on each individual wire. You simply place the wires into the appropriate spot on the punch-down block, you use your punch-down tool to quickly attach those wires into the block, and now you can move to the next set of wires. Here's a closer view of the unshielded twisted pair cable that has the individual wires inside, and you can see the 8 wires on the inside of this cable have been punched down into the 8 connections on this punch-down block. If you look closely, you can even see the metal contacts on the inside of the punch-down block that are able to pierce the insulation of these wires and make contact with the copper that's inside. Here's a similar punch-down block. In this case, the wires are run on the outside, and the wires themselves are individually punched down to the individual connectors on the punch-down block. Some of the most common copper connectors you'll run into are USB, or Universal Serial Bus. If you're running USB version 1.1 or 2.0, then you'll probably see a standard A plug very similar to this one. The standard B plug is a more square plug that's used for peripherals. And if you're using a mobile device, you're probably using a mini B plug or a micro B plug. If you're running a later version of USB, for example, USB 3.0, your A plug is very similar in size to the previous version, but you'll notice the standard B plug and the micro B plug are very different in this newer version of USB. We realized having all of these different USB interfaces creates additional cables and additional confusion. So instead, we have encapsulated all of these different connector types into one single type of USB connector called USB-C. USB-C is the physical connector type, which means we can run different types of signal over that same connector. For example, you could run USB connections over this, Thunderbolt, HDMI, and many other types of signals. If you're working in an older desktop, you may find that there's a 4-pin power connector used to power a number of peripherals inside of that computer. This 4-pin connector is referred to as a Molex connector. Technically speaking, the connector itself was created by a company named the Molex Connector Company. So to call this a Molex connector is only one of many different kinds of connectors made by the Molex Connector Company. You'll also see this connector referred to as an amp mate in-lock. This is a connector that provides power for fans, storage drives, and other components inside of your computer, and it commonly provides 12-volt and 5-volt power. You'll often see the Molex connector paired with the power input for the fan or storage drive that you need to power. These are relatively modular, and they often connect to each other with simply friction, so it's relatively easy to disconnect and reconnect them again. If you look at one of these older power supplies, these are relatively modular components inside of your computer, and it commonly provides 12-volt and 5-volt power. You'll often see the Molex connector paired with the power input for the fan or storage drive that you need to power. These are relatively modular, and they often connect to each other with simply friction, so it's relatively easy to disconnect and reconnect them again. If you look at one of these older power supplies, you'll see that Molex connectors are included with the other connector types for that power supply. If we look a little closer, you can see other connectors such as the main motherboard power, and of course, there are the Molex connectors that are used to power those internal peripherals. Many of our newer mobile devices use USB connections to be able to connect to power and data sources. But if you're using an older device from Apple, you may be using a Lightning connector. Lightning is an Apple proprietary connector, so you'll only see this used with other Apple products, and it's usually associated with iPhones, iPads, and other similar devices. When Lightning was introduced, micro USB was the style of connector that we commonly saw on mobile devices. But Apple wanted some additional power capabilities for their phones and their tablets, and they wanted a connector that could be inserted either way and still operate normally. Although the industry is moving towards USB-C as a standard, you may still find some devices using these Lightning connections. If you're a system administrator or a network troubleshooter, then you'll need a DB9 connection to connect to some of the older switches, routers, firewalls, and other devices. These DB9 connectors commonly transmit serial communication, and the standard for that communication is RS-232. It stands for Recommended Standard 232, and it's been around in the industry since about 1969. These days, we commonly use USB as our standard form of serial communication. But before we had USB, we had RS-232 running over these DB9 connections. So if you were plugging in a modem or a mouse, you were probably using DB9. These days, we still keep these in our bags because there are a number of switches, routers, and other infrastructure devices that use this type of connector as their console port. If you need to be able to directly connect to these devices and configure them at a command prompt, then you'll want to use the serial port connection that often is using a DB9 interface. 69. You were probably using DB9. These days, we still keep these in our bags because there are a number of switches, routers, and other infrastructure devices that use this type of connector as their console port. If you need to be able to directly connect to these devices and configure them at a command prompt, then you'll want to use the serial port connection that often is using a DB9 interface.
Make the most of your summer by saving on Coursera Plus. Get $159 off a year of access to over 10,000 learning programs.
If you're working with fiber optics, there are a number of standard interfaces you might find. One of these interface types is an ST interface, which is a straight tip. You can see the straight tip at the end of the connector, and this is a style of connector that is a bayonet connector, which means you push it in and slightly twist it to lock it in place. To be able to remove it, you need to untwist it and then remove it from the connector. This push and turn bayonet ensures that the fiber stays in place and can't accidentally be pulled out of the connector. Here's a closer view of the straight tip, and you can see the bayonet function on the side where you would push it in and then slightly turn it to lock it in place. Another more modern style of connector is the SC connector, or the subscriber connector. You might also see this referred to as a square connector or a standard connector. This style of connector also locks in place, but instead of using a bayonet, you push it in and it locks. You would need to slightly pull on the outside of the connector to be able to unlock it so that it can be removed from that interface. This is a popular style of connector, and it's used across many different devices, patch panels, and other components within the data center. This style of connector can be used with individual fibers, or you can combine them together as one single unit with a pair of fibers so that it can. You might also connector is the S it in and then slightly turn it to lock it in place. Another more modern style of connector is the SC connector, or the subscriber connector. You might also see this referred to as a square connector or a standard connector. This style of connector also locks in place, but instead of using a bayonet, you push it in and it locks. You would need to slightly pull on the outside of the connector to be able to unlock it so that it can be removed from that interface. This is a popular style of connector, and it's used across many different devices, patch panels, and other components within the data center. This style of connector can be used with individual fibers, or you can combine them together as one single unit with a pair of fiber inside. This makes it very easy to connect and disconnect both the send and receive side from a connection all at the same time. There's always a need to fit more connections into a smaller amount of space. In order to do this with fiber, you could use a Lucent connector or an LC connector. This is a much smaller, more compact connection, and this one holds in place with a clip that's on the top of the connector. You might also see this connection type referred to as a local connector or a little connector. Here's a better view of an LC connector with both sides of it connected together so that you can easily connect and disconnect a pair of fibers simultaneously. And here's all three of the connectors together: the ST connector, the SC connector, and the LC. You can see the ST is probably the largest of the three. The SC is certainly in the middle, and obviously the LC is much smaller than either of them. All of these connectors work effectively the same way. They allow you to connect and disconnect from a fiber connection. You obviously want to be sure that the connectors that you're using match the same connectors on the devices you're connecting to, and in many cases it will be an ST, SC, or LC connection.
No matter what kind of work your team does, Asana can help manage it. From project intake to campaign management to strategic planning and more, Asana works for you. Try it for free today at asana.com.